Well, welcome back, everyone. Today I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Timothy
Bartholomaus.
Bartholomaus.
Yeah. Yep.
Fantastic. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so quick introduction on you. You have an AB in Earth Sciences from Dartmouth. You have an MS in Geological Sciences from the University of Colorado Boulder. You have a PhD in Geophysics from Alaska Fairbanks. And then you've been working in geology, geomorphology, and geophysics for the past 22 years, during which time you've published multiple papers and led teams of scientists all over the globe looking at glaciers and icebergs, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now you're at the University of Idaho here, enjoying your time with rocks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's a great spot.
we'll jump right in. And kind of broadly speaking, what's the definition of an iceberg and a glacier, and how do those two differ?
Yeah, a glacier is a mass of ice formed from snow, so it has to fall out of the sky as snow. That snow has to stick around through the whole following summer, then turn into ice and also move under its own weight. And so that distinguishes it from things like sea ice or the ice that's, the ice that sticks to the roads about this time of year. So it has to be actually moving. Yeah.
Got it. And an iceberg is it just part of a glacier? Or?
So some glaciers are in places where, for a lot of glaciers, like, especially around here, Montana, the Washington State, the Cascades, the Rockies, the glaciers they flow from high elevations to low elevations. And then eventually the glaciers get to low enough elevations that all of the ice melts. They just can no longer survive the heat of the summers.
Got it.
Some glaciers are in places where the weather is so bad, because glaciers love crummy weather. The weather is so bad that the glaciers flow all the way to the ocean, and they still haven't yet melted. And so once a glacier gets all the way to the ocean, then it can start to break off and actually start to form icebergs. And so an iceberg is actually a piece of glacier ice that has cracked off of a glacier and then now is floating away into the ocean.
Right. So when the snow falls and it begins the process of creating a glacier, I'm sure that takes quite a long time. But what causes the pressure to condense the ice into the snow into ice?
Yeah,
and
great question.
Such a thick ice too.
Yeah, exactly. So, like we were just saying, that the ice has to make it through that following summer. The snow has to make it through the following summer. Then you get to the next winter and you get another kind of layer of snow that also makes it through the following summer. And so every single year you accumulate a little bit more snow, a little bit more snow, a little bit more snow, until you basically pile up, a stack of snow that, would reach to the stars if it were not moving. And so the reason that you have glaciers is they are in these spots where every single year they just get thicker and thicker and thicker. And it is that thickness on a slope, just like if you poured out a jar of honey on a dinner plate and then tilted it, you tilt that thick honey on a dinner plate and it's going to start to move. And so that's what gets glaciers to move. And typically then they flow down to lower elevations where ultimately they melt.
Got it. So they are only moving because they're going from higher to lower, correct?
Exactly.
So I would assume there are some glaciers that are not built off of mountains and are therefore just kind of stagnant.
Yeah. And so back during the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, all of Canada was covered in ice, and ice that was so thick and so big that it came down into Idaho. In fact, came into past Sandpoint and filled all of Lake Pend Oreille. All of Lake Pend Oreille was the end of one glacier.
Got it.
But at the center of that especially large glacier, what we call an ice sheet, that ice sheet was basically flat. And just like Antarctica is today, Antarctica is flatter. They say that Kansas is flat, but Kansas is like mountainous terrain compared to the middle of Antarctica. It is flatter than flat, and that means that ice is creeping ever so slightly. It is just on the most imperceptible of grades, and that imperceptible slope leads to just, motion on the order of, motion at the rate of like your fingernails growing. It's so flat, even though it's especially thick. But then it's sort of like the ice sheets, it's sort of like going off of a roller coaster. It just sort of gets steeper and steeper and steeper until, now you've got glaciers that are really kind of charging out ahead.
Yeah, and because there is one mountain in Antarctica, correct? Is that?
Yeah, there's actually
that one big one, correct?
There's it has a highest peak, but there's actually a whole mountain range. The Transantarctic Mountains is a mountain range that sort of splits the Antarctica into sort of about, a quarter of it or a third of it is what we call West Antarctica. West and East are sort of arbitrary when you're on the South Pole. But the rest of it we call East Antarctica, which is the bigger portion. The fascinating thing, about 10 years ago, there was a project that went to Antarctica to actually look at mountain ranges that were entirely buried. And so underneath the ice, under about a mile of ice, there's an entire mountain range the size of the Alps that is just completely submerged. And you would never know. You would be walking around on the surface of the Antarctic ice sheet, flat as could be, and yet underneath it are all these craggy peaks and valleys and cirques and a whole beautiful alpine landscape.
Wow.
Entirely submerged beneath the ice.
Yeah, that's wild. And is that the same situation as a glacier forming where it was a long time of snow? Is that the best guess of science?
Yeah, exactly. It's just been it has been snow covered for so long that that ice came down off of the mountain peaks. It started, it always starts on the mountain peaks, came down, but then never really melted and ends up filling up the valleys in between, the coming down the next mountains. It meets in the middle. It keeps growing and growing and growing until ultimately you've got, there's no rock left. The whole thing is submerged.
Yeah, and it's just gravity that causes the snow to form to ice, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay. And yeah, exactly. Gravity and the pressure of all of the rest of the snow up above it. So in Antarctica,
got it.
Just like with a snowball, if you're feeling nasty and you want to make a really tight snowball, what do? You add water, right? A slush ball makes the worst kind of snowballs. And so that's the same thing with glaciers. If you have water and you add water to snow, then it's going to turn into ice a lot faster. So with, in Washington or in places in Alaska, you can go from snow to ice in about, 5 or 10 years. In Antarctica, it's so dry. This is why nobody wants to have a snowball fight on a -20-degree day. It's just,
that's got to be the worst.
It's cold and you can't really even get the snow to stick to itself. Okay. And so that snow takes 100 or 1,000 years to turn into ice.
Wow. Okay. Have you ever been to Antarctica?
Yeah, once.
Okay. Well, were you there for research, I would assume?
Yeah, I spent a season there in the middle of the West Antarctic ice sheet, and we were drilling a ice core through the ice sheet that we went through the 2,000 years of history. Then actually I was my job was to sort of pull out the ice receive the ice that the drill would pull out. So they had a kind of a very fancy, just like you might you go up to the Silver Valley and the rock coring rigs are set up to kind of pull out rock cores to figure out where the metal ore is. Here you drill for an ice core, you pull out the ice, and then you can analyze what's in that ice. And in places you can actually go back and see, this is the snow, actually passed through my hands was the snow that fell when King Tut was reigning over Egypt.
Good night.
Yeah. And then you go back further and further and further into the snow. The oldest snow that we've got is actually snow that fell 800,000 years ago. So you can actually touch the snow and the ice from that long ago. And inside that snow and ice is actually little microscopic air bubbles that is even the air from 800,000 years ago, which is just wild that this isn't, science, a lot of it is based on inference, or you're trying to kind of interpret from one thing and extrapolate to another thing.
In theory and such, yeah.
Yeah. Here is the very air from like almost 1,000,000 years ago, which is just like mind-boggling to me.
So how do you determine something's age like that? Because that's a long time. Surely there's some room of error, correct?
Yeah. So so basically what you can do is, for a lot of it, you can actually, there are annual cycles, just like in tree rings. There are annual cycles that are, you can see, like, you can actually just count year after year after year after year and get at, and that gets you back about 10,000 years or so you can actually count annual years, and those annual years that come from, they come from the sea salt. So basically, during the winter, when the more of the ocean is frozen, the air is less salty, and then in the summer, in the Antarctic summer, as the sea ice retreats, then there's a little bit more salt in the air that just comes from the ocean, even hundreds of miles away.
So you measure salt concentration.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it.
And then so you can count those. Then there's also, we can find layers of volcanic ash. So when sometimes you get a particularly big volcanic eruption, it sends up enough ash, and then we can actually identify that ash layer because it has exactly the same chemistry. It's like volcanic eruptions are like fingerprints. You actually can date, you can figure out this is the ash from, say, like Mount St. Helens or something like that, because it has a unique chemical fingerprint.
Got it.
And so we can find that all around the world and in Antarctica.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as far as like finding things in there besides ash and layers of salt composition, is there anything that you've come across that blew your mind?
Let's see. I know, not that I've found, but another little piece of fascinating trivia about Antarctica. There are places where it's actually one of the spots where people find the most meteorites, because meteorites fall into the Antarctica, and then there are places in Antarctica where the snow doesn't accumulate, where it's so windy that the snow always gets stripped off.
Interesting.
And so the snow is always getting stripped off. You have this bare blue ice, and then any meteorite that has ever fallen to Earth is just sitting there
on the
surface of the ice.
Yeah.
And you just like walk around, and you're like, you think you see like a black speck like off a mile away, and it's the only black speck in a sea of dark blue ice. Walk over there, pick it up, and it's just like a solid hunk of metal that came in from outer space.
That's wild.
Yeah.
And totally makes sense.
Yeah.
That they would just like fall there and then
they don't get buried. You know, like everywhere
Yeah.
else on Earth, they get buried because the Earth is always in motion, but
not there.
Not there.
Yeah. So how much does a glacier weigh?
So the thickest glaciers are up to about like 2 miles thick. And so, ice weighs about as much as water. So, if you have a sense for like what a gallon of water is, well, a gallon's volume of ice is about the same thing.
Oh, really? Okay.
With 2 miles of ice, I don't know if I could do the math that fast, but, one of the interesting things, so, the glaciers and ice sheets are changing a lot, they're losing a lot of mass. And one of the kind of bizarre numbers that you use, and you only see this really in glaciology, but is the gigaton, where we're talking about how many gigatons did Greenland lose last year, and it's like 300 gigatons, which is 10 to the 10 to the 9th tons, so 10 to the 12th kilograms. We're talking about, all right, so many millions, thousands of millions of pounds of ice are lost or gained from these ice sheets. They are so massive that, when you lose just a a percent, you're talking about,
Shocking amounts.
just like, I mean, nobody could conceive of this a number. It's just like, I don't know.
It's unfathomable.
It's unfathomable.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And those go into, like, do they melt and go into the sea?
Yeah,
or?
exactly. Right. So, I mean, right now, the sea level globally is rising at the average rate of about like an inch every decade. In the last in some places, it's much faster. It's like, it's gone up like 8 inches in the last 2 decades or something like that, 4 inches in a decade, which is like, that's a really significant amount. But yeah, I mean, the ice sheets are melting, and, they contribute. Greenland is about 1 millimeter a year. Antarctica is about 1 millimeter a year, which, millimeter, like, okay, great. Can we even measure that? Like,
That's a lot of ice.
Yeah.
When you're talking about.
But when it keeps happening, and if either, all of the water, there's a fixed amount of water on land, on Earth, and you either freeze it in an ice sheet or you melt it and put it in the ocean. It's like, those are your 2 options.
Yeah.
And so, when the ice sheets melt, they go into the ocean.
Right. And there are different kinds of ice. Like, there's the dark blue ice, and then there's that more aerated ice.
Yeah, totally.
And I would assume that the dark blue ice not only takes longer to form, but also would weigh significantly more.
Yeah. And so most of the glaciers and ice sheets are actually formed of that dark blue ice. That is the kind of like, that is the look of a glacier. It only gets aerated and bubbly and lower density up on the surface. And so that's kind of it's sort of a funny thing, because like you think like, well, I know that ice is supposed to be like dark blue and hard and solid, but yet every time I see a picture of a glacier, it looks white.
Yeah.
And so that whiteness is just the sort of the melting and the kind of the sort of the starting to kind of the dissolution and the breakdown of that glacier. And so more air is getting in there, more air bubbles are getting in there. And all of the faces of those air bubbles end up reflecting and scattering sunlight, and they scatter all wavelengths, really? And so it looks white.
Oh, interesting. So that's why it's white, not just because it's less concentrated.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And if you ever see an iceberg calf, which I'm sure you have, it flips over and it's a deeper blue.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. And you can see that. And when you see that deeper blue or those darker colors, then you're like, okay, this is ice that has never seen sunlight. And, give it another, couple of hours or something like that, and our dark blue will end up looking white as it starts to melt and kind of cracks get
It's
into
that
it.
fast.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That's pretty wild. And then, it's funny because there's a lot of places on Earth, like, for instance, the Grand Canyon, which kind of looks like it's been carved out by a glacier, or at least something of that size, strength, power.
Yeah.
I'm a Christian, so I believe in the flood. But is there explanation that like a glacier could have caused that as well?
Yeah. There's no sign of a glacier. So glaciers end up making actually sort of U-shaped valleys.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They have a very characteristic look where they has steep mountain walls, which certainly the Grand Canyon has, but then sort of a broad, flat floor. And that is sort of the classic look of a glacial landscape.
Is it anything like a fjord, like in Norway or?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So all of the fjords are glacially carved, and so those are glaciers that were carving out below sea level, and those glaciers were grinding against the rock and mud even below sea level, and then the glaciers melted, leaving behind fjords.
Yes, and a lot of water.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, and they also make sounds.
Yeah.
Is that right? Glaciers make sounds?
Yeah.
Because I've heard, I love watching these videos on the internet of the guys who go in the glaciers in like Iceland, and you can like the carved, like geometrically shaped dark blue ice all around them. Caves.
Yeah, exactly.
Dripping, and it makes weird sounds. What's happening there?
Yeah. I mean, they can move. They make a lot of different kinds of sounds. They make, there's the sound of the cracking ice. There's the sound of sort of echoes. If you're in an ice cave, there's the sound of the rushing water underneath the glacier. I think that there's a lot of different. I'm not sure exactly which sounds you're referring to.
I think the ones I've heard most are like it's like a ping.
Okay.
It's like it's almost like you're flicking a rock across the surface of a pond or something.
Yeah, I know there are some apparently if you drill an ice core and you have this very deep hole, then you drop a little chip of something down that hole, and it makes what sounds to me almost like a laser cartoon, like pew pew pew.
I think that's the sound I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's bizarre. It feels like a like a sci-fi sound effect.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of fascinating.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically the echoes. It's just all of those echoes.
Yeah. And there's like 70% of the world's fresh water is in glaciers.
Yeah, that's right.
Or maybe even more.
I think it might be over 90. I don't know, but it's like
it's a lot.
It's a lot. Yeah.
Is there ever going to be a point where potentially we mine those glaciers for that fresh water?
In a way, that's actually already happening. Because there are people who live just downstream of these glaciers, in places where the climate is extremely arid. They don't get very much rain, and then they'll go months and months and months without any rain, but they live below a glacier which is always melting and always producing some water.
Got it.
And they are just reliant on that area. And so especially around in the Andes, in the Himalaya, it's
like a reserve.
Yeah, exactly. They have a naturally occurring reservoir.
Right.
That is just sort of forms itself and then just continuously quenches the thirst of the people that live downstream.
Yes. How nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're going out to study a glacier and research it, what exactly are you studying and looking for?
So my research is heavily focused on trying to understand how glaciers move. How do they work? What are the sort of the mechanics of a glacier? And so I'm interested in sort of what makes a glacier speed up abruptly or break apart and make icebergs like we were talking about before, make icebergs 10 times as fast as it had been. And so I'm interested in those kinds of factors that control how fast one of these glaciers is moving. Because you mentioned Christianity, and I'm as a Christian as well, and so a lot of my the thinking in the back of my head is like, how do we, like Christ says, take care of your neighbors. Like you have
Absolutely.
to, your like number one job after loving
Love
and
the Lord your
respecting
God.
me
Yeah.
is your neighbors. And so all of the people that are depending on those sort of glacier water towers, so sometimes they call them the natural reservoirs, or that live around the coasts. How do those people prepare for and prepare for the changes that are happening right now, where they're losing their glacier water towers, where they're getting flooded on the coastlines. And so, what are those, how are the glaciers changing now, and how are they going to change in the future?
Right.
So that's kind of the big question.
How can we help them understand what's happening so that they don't get overwhelmed or underwhelmed?
Yeah, totally. Right. Exactly. That, that they can continue to thrive. People are accustomed to living as, human societies, we've got like, people have been, living where they've been living for thousands and thousands of years. And so, now, and the climate is really changing very quickly. How do we prepare them to, to anticipate what's coming so that they will be less hurt by that, or their lives will be less
more
disrupted.
Prepared.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And so how do you go about studying and researching this is what the glacier is going to do, what it's doing right now, what it has done, what it will do?
Totally. I'll take that. Two things. One, so one of the projects that I'm working on is on glaciers that surge. And so surging glaciers are glaciers that, will basically, not move much at all. They'll be moving maybe, 3 or 4 feet every day, which is, I don't know, fast or slow, depending on your frame of reference.
Might sound like a lot.
Yeah. Well, for some glaciers, it's, yeah. But then these same glaciers, they'll go from about 3 or 4 feet every day to all of a sudden moving 100 feet a day. And they will increase their rates of motion by, 20-fold or 30-fold.
That's much more significant.
So much faster.
Yeah.
And they'll do this periodically. So they'll go from, the glacier that I'm working on right now in Alaska, it does this, it has about 4 or 5 years of just kind of quiet, and then 2 years where it just goes nuts. And it is just tearing itself to pieces, running off the mountainsides. The whole glacier is erupting into crevasses. It's like, it is a thing of violence. And it's actually the most, it was sort of staggering the first time I saw it, because I've been around a lot of glaciers, but I never seen one like this. It felt like walking into a crime scene of Yeah,
I can imagine the sheer power of that glacier.
Yeah, totally. And then, it does that for a year and a half or 2 years, and then goes back to just chilling and not really moving much at all.
Doing its life.
Yeah. And so we know that has a lot to do with how water moves through and underneath the glacier.
Okay.
And so we can actually use seismometers. So the same kinds of equipment that earthquake scientists use, we can use those and put those out on and in and around the glacier, and use that to listen to water moving through underneath the glacier. And so even though we can't see the water, just like when you're, next to a mountain river and you can almost if it's a big, powerful mountain river, you can almost feel the vibrations coming off of this river. Well, underneath glaciers, those same rivers underneath ice also shake the ground, even though we can't see them.
Yeah, I imagine.
But with these really sensitive instruments, we can record it.
Got it.
So we can track what the water's doing, where the water is, how that water gets stored, and so we're using things like seismometers that we put out around this glacier to say, okay, when it's surging, when it's going nuts, how is water moving through and underneath this glacier? When it's quiet, how is water moving through and underneath this glacier? And that's going to allow us to better understand how glaciers do kind of, what are now relatively unpredictable or hard to track things.
Right.
And that sort of motivates into the second kind of big scale project, because how we know what glaciers are going to do in the future is through computer models. So we write down all of the rules, all of the physics, all of the climate about glaciers. We put those all together into big computer codes, just like we can use to understand, the weather in 4 days from now, or population changes, or anything else, anything that you want to know about how the Earth works. Can you write that down into these equations, and then you run that forward into the future? Now, those equations are pretty good, and those models are pretty good, and they're totally sufficient to tell us that, the glaciers are melting now, and they're going to keep melting. But, for those people who live on the coast, just knowing that flooding is coming, that the ocean is rising. Yeah, it doesn't stop it, and it's not particularly useful in terms of planning. You're like, okay, I want to build a wall between me and the ocean. Do I need it to be 6 inches? Do I need it to be 6 feet? And so the work of glaciologists informs those kinds of models, where we're trying to figure out, all right, exactly how much is the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets likely to move and to lose ice, and that kind of understanding that goes into that equations can come out of projects like this one on glacier surges, which is all about how do these glaciers move? How does water move underneath these glaciers?
Got it. And so it's like a river is underneath the glacier. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And so, sometimes people refer to glaciers as, as rivers of ice. Well, beneath those rivers of ice are actually rivers of water that move through tunnels and plumbing and conduits. And there's like a whole series of, I think of them as like a systems of like aqueducts and, the plumbing here in Moscow and running through all of the buildings. It's like, the work of a glaciologist is almost like, the work of a plumber, but you're not actually allowed to touch any of the pipes. And you have to just figure out where they are and how this plumbing system works, but without ever getting underneath the sink.
Yeah.
And so you have to be kind of creative about what methods you're going to use.
Yeah. Got it. But they're not floating on top of these rivers, correct?
No. They're still very much resting on ice, resting on the rock and sediment below them. But the water that is within these glaciers, the amount of water and the water pressure fluctuates a lot. And so sometimes in some places and under some instances, the water pressure underneath a glacier, and I've seen this, the water pressure underneath a glacier can be so high that the water ends up squirting out the top of the glacier like a geyser, like a
Couldn't handle
fountain.
it anymore. Yeah.
No, exactly. Can't hold me back. And so that water, but that only lasted for an hour or two, and it was under a very special kind of circumstance. And so, that was a case where the water would have floated the entirety of the glacier if it could have. And that idea of flotation, you're onto something there, because when you increase the water pressure underneath the glacier, that actually does make the glacier slide faster. It kind of reduces the friction between the ice and the rock below it.
Right.
And so, being a glaciologist is oftentimes sort of very much related to also being a hydrologist.
Got it. That makes sense. And so that water spraying out the top.
Yeah.
What is that telling you? Is there anything that's telling you besides the water pressure underneath is ridiculously high, and also the ice is not particularly solid?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Because you're onto another thing there, where a glacier, you go to say like Mount Rainier or something like that, and look at the glaciers, and they look like solid and frozen, and yet all through them are cracks and fissures and holes and tunnels, and within all those cracks and fissures and tunnels is just water that's just sort of like moving up and down like an aquifer. Like we have all of our groundwater here is, all of our drinking water comes from a groundwater aquifer where the water level rises and falls. Well, the same thing happens underneath the glacier. Now, what does it tell you when the glacier water's spurting out? I guess the other key piece is the sense of the connectedness. We said that being a glaciologist is like being a plumber, but you don't really know what's connected to what and by how much. And so when that geyser was actually the result of a lake, a big glacier dammed lake that had just started to break loose, and all of the water from this lake that had been impounded behind, again, what looked like a solid wall of ice, all of a sudden that entire lake all drained down, like out, and then like into and underneath the glacier. Like the lake just disappeared.
Gone.
Yeah, gone. And all of that water went into the glacier. And then, we were curious about like, well, where does the water go? Obviously, it goes downhill, but some of it apparently goes out this geyser.
Comes out yeah.
Yeah. And so it gives you a sense of like how connected is all the plumbing underneath this ice.
You can only really see it when it shoots out the top.
Yeah, exactly.
More or less.
Yeah. Or, what you can also do is you can drill holes down in and put water pressure sensors.
Okay.
There's some other, or, put out those seismometers to listen for the water going by. So yeah, there's some other kind of tricks, but a lot of it is trying to figure out, all right, where's the water? How's the water moving through under this glacier? And how does that affect how the glacier is moving? Because at the same time as there was a geyser, not coincidentally, the glacier all of a sudden sped up by 5-fold. This was a glacier that's moving on average about a foot a day, and it all of a sudden started going 5 feet a day while that geyser was coming through.
Got it. And I would assume that the water starts building up the closer it gets to the bottom because it's also melting the glacier, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
And so are there cycles of like, you're going to see kind of a big push here and then the water's going to drain itself all out and then you'll see another big push in the next however many years or months it may be?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so that's one of the questions. So, as the climate is warming and the glaciers are melting more and more, does that mean, so there's going to be more water going into the glaciers? And does that mean that every day where it's hot, the glacier is just going to go faster and faster and faster? Like that was an honest and kind of legitimate research question. But we've found instead that actually the tunnels and the plumbing underneath the glacier actually grow to accommodate the water that's being fed to it.
Fascinating.
So you just dump more water, and for a little while the tunnels are tight and it's a tight fit and they back up. It's like your, again, plumbing metaphors, but your toilet backs up because the water just can't get through the tight squeezes of the underneath the ice.
Right.
But then the tunnels grow, and now they can handle, whatever water you throw at them, and they will basically not even respond.
They're not phased.
They're not at all phased.
That's wild.
So, but then the glaciers heal, right? So then they flow and they kind of collapse down and they pinch off all those tunnels again.
Yeah.
So sort of the glaciers are always changing. I mean, it's not surprising that, Native Americans thought of glaciers as sort of as animate objects, that they were truly alive.
Right.
Because they are evolving and changing and doing wild, unexpected things.
Yeah. And so when you're looking at seismometers and other tools you're using to measure these, what indicators are you looking for that would show you, hey, something's about to happen, or, we're 2 years out from something?
Yeah. So, good question. So that's really right. That is very much the forefront of some of the research that I'm doing right now, where we're trying to figure that out. And so we can actually, there are some ways that we can process this seismic data to potentially, and we're trying to figure out if this is going to work, to see how much water is stored underneath the glacier. Now, the moving water shakes the ice, and so that's kind of relatively easy to pick up. But these glacier surges, these abrupt switches in behavior, we think, and we're pretty sure, that has to do with a sort of an accumulation of water, where you kind of are loading up the glacier with all this excess water, and then all of a sudden you get a big sort of abrupt, everything kind of cuts loose. And so there may be some processing that we can do to, based on how seismic waves move through and underneath the ice, to identify, when that's going to happen.
Yeah. And the goal is to understand what's happening. And is it possible to direct the glaciers, or are we not there yet?
Not really. Yeah.
They kind of go where they want.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. They're going to go downhill, and so, fortunately most people, again, with Native Americans, actually with these surges, there were some surges actually came through and they did like obliterate villages. And in fact, actually, even in medieval Europe, there are signs of Christians who hadn't quite yet figured out how glaciers work, of members of a church being led by a priest out to a glacier to try and get God to command the glacier to stop moving.
Pray that this limits itself.
Right. And that doesn't, at least there's no signs.
It didn't work for them.
We'll say that.
We can keep praying.
That's right. We'll keep praying.
But no success for them.
Not for them. And so, the glaciers are just going to keep coming.
They're going to keep coming. That would be terrifying, though.
Yeah.
If you could see it and you're like, I'm pretty sure it keeps getting closer.
Right.
But
exactly.
I can't exactly tell.
Exactly.
And my house is in the way.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And, yeah.
So is the move then to just, okay, we got to leave this spot?
Yeah. And fortunately, now, I mean, most there's not a lot of people that live, right at the bottoms of glaciers.
It seems like a poor real estate development.
Yes, exactly. And, well, now, unfortunately, most glaciers are retreating. They're getting smaller. And so the likelihood of glacier sort of overrunning your house is kind of, we're in a good time for that.
Yeah. And so when a glacier finally does reach the ocean, and I would assume a question off of that, are glaciers limited in their size, or do they just keep growing out the back as they kind of like it moves forward and the back grows?
Yeah.
So it's still connected to its original source.
Yeah. So, glaciers come in all kinds of, well, not all sizes. The ice needs to be thick enough for it to actually flow, for there needs to be enough weight on it to get it to move. But beyond that lowest possible limit, you could, there are signs in Earth's past that the entirety of the Earth was covered in an ice sheet. All the oceans were covered in ice. And this is a observation or kind of an explanation called snowball Earth, which is kind of an amazing vision. But
rough day to be a human.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, fortunately, they were not humans then. But this is what was I going to say? I've lost it.
Snowball Earth.
Yeah, so there are times when the glaciers have been bigger. Oh, yeah, right. What's the maximum size of a glacier? Well, you go from glaciers keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And like we were saying, how Antarctica formed. Well, eventually those glaciers just get big enough that they cover the peaks and then they kind of flow off in all directions. And so those larger glaciers we call either ice caps if they're kind of medium big. And then beyond that, if they're even bigger than that, then we call them an ice sheet. And there's only two real ice sheets. There's the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet today.
Got it.
In the past, there used to be more ice sheets.
Yeah.
But the distinction between, a little glacier that you might see in the Cascades or in Glacier National Park and Antarctica, the only difference is size. It's fundamentally, Antarctica is just a really, really big glacier that kept growing until it spilled off into the ocean in all directions.
Right. Yeah. And there's not really a high likelihood of it melting, correct? The one in Antarctica, at least.
Yeah. It parts of it are melting, and parts of it, this is the other, another major source of research. But there are glaciers there. Some of the really major outlets, a single glacier that's like 100 miles wide and hundreds of miles long. Mm-hmm. I mean, like monster stuff.
Right.
And those glaciers are actually getting smaller. And so there's a lot of concern as to, how fast are they going to get smaller? Is there any prospect of them stabilizing? Like if we get, global warming under control, will it chill out and stop kind of breaking apart? Because if all of Antarctica were to melt, it would raise ocean levels by 160 feet.
So not good.
No, exactly.
We'd be okay here.
Yeah, Moscow okay.
A bummer for Seattle.
Yeah. Seattle would be tough. Florida would be tough.
Yeah.
Louisiana would be tough. Anywhere. Yeah. I mean, it's just so it's not happening right now. But again, on this sort of broader mission of like, how do we help people who live on the coasts prepare? We want to figure out like, all right, how much of a threat is this? Like,
right.
How fast is this happening?
Yeah. And then, so it reaches the sea. And then what causes it to become an iceberg, to kind of break off?
Yeah. Another topic of active research. But the general message is when there's sort of too much stress on it. And so if you have one glacier and if one part of the ice kind of gets stuck, but the other ice is like flows off into the ocean and loses its resistance from the walls. Mm-hmm. So the glaciers are kind of the things that are holding the glaciers back is friction. It's just the friction underneath the ice and the friction at the edges. Well, these glaciers, they get to the ocean and then they actually, because ice is less dense than water, just like an ice cube floats in your glass of ice water, the whole glacier will actually will go afloat it will actually start to float
That's wild.
up on the glacier on the ocean.
Yeah.
Separate. I mean, just like, you or I walking off the shore of Lake Coeur d'Alene, like, you just eventually keep walking and you're going to float.
Right.
And so the glaciers do that too. But as that happens, if they lose contact with the side walls and then they stretch too much, that stretching can end up tearing the ice away.
Yeah.
And so it starts to fracture, and you basically, this is the way that you produce, every 9 months or something like that, it seems like you read about another iceberg the size of Rhode Island or something like that. And so those big icebergs are the result of that, like, too much stretching, and the ice is just not strong enough to hold itself together.
Got it. And that makes sense because, it's coming in at a downhill, and then if it flattens out, you're going to scrunch something.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so that kind of all of a sudden that torquing can really also sort of rip at a glacier from the bottom.
Yeah. And then once it breaks off, I had the opportunity to go up to Alaska a couple of years ago, and
Nice.
we saw a glacier.
Awesome.
We went out and we jumped in the water by it, which was fun.
Nice. Bold.
But then we saw a small iceberg calve,
Cool.
which was fascinating, but I didn't know why it happened.
Yeah. So in Alaska, a lot of those glaciers. So I did my PhD up in Alaska, and my project was actually on iceberg calving.
Oh, really?
And,
Okay.
Yeah.
There you
And
go.
so what we were learning there is that in Alaska, that calving is a sort of a mechanical and a fracturing process. And so you
Interesting.
think of, you basically have this solid mass of ice, and an iceberg is a piece of glacier that has just broken, like it is cracked off, and it just, I don't know, like bending a paperclip too many times. Ultimately, the metal fatigues and it snaps.
Yeah.
A glacier, you put too much stress on that ice and it will snap. And but in Alaska, it's one of the important sort of relevant influences is actually ocean water. And so,
Interesting.
and it's sort of obvious. I mean, you're there, the glacier is in the ocean, and for you jumping in the water, it was probably pretty darn cold.
It was
I'm just
very
imagining.
cold. Yeah, shockingly cold.
Yeah. What's fascinating is if you were especially tall, if your feet were, say, let's say 30 feet below your head or shoulders, your feet would actually be in pretty warm water. It can be, let's see, up to 50. Yeah, up to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 50-degree water, which is not like,
That's wild.
yeah, not, I mean, I don't
It's
know,
not-
not comfortable.
Right, we're not the Bahamas.
Right, not the Bahamas, but it's certainly plenty warm to melt
It's
ice.
15 plus degrees warmer.
Yeah, exactly. And so that warm ocean current that is just sort of drifting by the toes of all of these glaciers actually can melt, in some cases, melt up to 50 feet of ice in just a day as that water is melting the ice underneath the waterline. So all you see is sort of like a wall of a glacier coming down and icebergs cracking in over the top, over your head,
Right.
and
Yeah.
very dramatic and scary. But what's underneath the sea level is just this warm ocean water just swirling around, continuously melting all of the ice below it. And when you remove all the ice underneath, the icebergs on the top just sort of collapse in.
Right. And then they're floating there. What causes them to flip over?
Yeah, and so that is also a result of, so they flip when they're top heavy. When there's more mass above the water than there is below. Well,
Okay.
again, what's removing then? What's removing the mass below the
it's
water
the warm,
line?
It's the warm
water.
currents.
That's right.
Got it.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And that's why I would assume that's why the ice is such a deep blue, because it's slightly melting and then compressing.
Well, it was compressed hundreds of years ago when the glacier formed.
Right.
Now it's cracked
you're
off.
stripping away everything.
You've stripped off the
core.
Yes, exactly.
Got it.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a lot I'm sure we don't know, as we've discussed.
Yeah.
What is like in the upcoming years, what are you most excited about for glacier study and research?
Yeah. So right now, the project that I've been putting a lot of energy towards right now is this big sort of international community effort of ice sheet modelers to basically better anticipate sea level rise. And so, there are, we know water affects how fast glaciers move. We know when it gets hotter, the glaciers melt. But beyond that, there's still a lot of intricacies. And so we're trying to really figure out, okay, we think we know how these glaciers work. Like, what if we get 20 different people, all with their best understanding of how the glaciers work? They all run their computer simulations independently. And then let's see how those different models perform. Like, we can compare them a bit against the actual observations and rank and score them based on how well they perform. And then we can use those simulations to say, well, this model, this set of computer simulations, it did really well at, reproducing all of the changes of the last 40 years. I've got more confidence in that model predicting the next 40 years.
It's more or less accurate from what we've seen.
Yeah.
Maybe
we got it. Maybe this one's got the right answer. And so we are really trying to kind of bolster this international effort. And it really only works when you get all the players in the room all contributing their models. Because even if you've got, even if your model is like, an ace and my model is the D student, we both want to play because we really only know what's right or wrong by some models not quite measuring up.
Right.
And so, and the more
mine is an ace because it only fails in some situations.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And so I think we have the prospect of really improving our understanding of how ice sheets work through this big collaborative effort. And I'm just getting a lot of energy out of being part of a really collaborative effort. It's a fun community, and it's nice to see everybody, whether they're Christian or not, is all motivated by trying to help other people and say, all right, well, this is an important problem. I can help, and they're stepping up, which is, I think, really cool.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
If you could recommend like one iceberg for everyone out there who haven't gone to any icebergs, or glaciers, which one should they go to?
Well, for icebergs, the one you can get to, icebergs are hard to come by. I think there are, the areas around Anchorage, in kind of Prince William Sound, those are some of the, we call them tidewater glaciers, these glaciers that flow into the ocean. Those are probably among the most accessible. Glaciers that don't make icebergs but are still wonderful to explore. There's some pretty good and close ones on, say, like Mount Baker that has some close trails, and you still have to hike a little ways, but you can get up there and touch the ice, which is pretty awesome.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
You get to touch a glacier.
Yeah.
As we kind of wrap up here, I always like to ask, what's your best piece of advice you would give to anyone watching?
Well, I think, with respect to climate change, I think that there's a lot of sort of gloomy news out there. We know that we're on like whatever umpteenth month of record-breaking temperatures again.
Yes, I was told in 2005 that the world was going to be over by now.
Yeah, right. So, well, I don't know who told you that, but there is cause for a lot of concern. And yet there's also a lot of cause for hope. And so I think that is one of the really important messages that I think, especially for younger folks who are like, geez, like what is the world coming to? There's actually there are new technologies. People are making new decisions. There are, the energy system is changing where we're able to rely on more, clean air energy sources. And so, those knobs are being turned, and I think that that's a really, hopeful piece of information for that, that people need to know about.
Where can people find you and your work and research and all of that online?
So I'm on Blue Sky. I have which is a social media app. I've got a website. My papers are on there. I've done a number of other sort of media interviews. In fact, a very popular one on mossballs that sort of rolled around on glaciers. Taking classes. So I teach online, and I teach.
Come to the U of I.
Come to UI. Yeah.
There you go. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been
absolutely.
fantastic.
Thanks, Jackson.
Yeah. See you guys.